Hello, book lovers. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Check This Out is a series where I interview emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. A series brought to you by New Hampshire Public Radio and the PEN-Faulkner Foundation. PEN-Faulkner administers major literary awards and programs, including the PEN-Faulkner Award for Fiction. We have a lot of exciting books and authors coming your way this season. Next week, I talked with Samir Pandya about his new book, Our Beautiful Boys. Tune in next week for that interview. Today on my show, my guest is Tova Mirvis, and we are discussing her brand new novel, her debut thriller, We Would Never. We Would Never opens by telling us the character Jonah is going to be murdered, and his wife and her family will become the main suspects. The police are convinced this is a murder for hire. Jonah was killed by his wife's family because he and his wife are deep into a contentious divorce and custody battle. From there, author Tova Mirvis digs into the backstory to tell us how we got there. The focus is really less on solving the crime and more on character studies, asking again and again what kind of person would hire someone to kill for them. Just how bad can things get? Mirvis really zeroes in on the families and the slow descent that leads to the murder for hire. This book was personal for me because it was based on the 2014 real-life murder of a man who was actually a friend of mine back in college. We weren't really that close, and we hadn't been in touch since graduation before he was murdered, but it shook me when I heard about his death and watched the real-life story unfold.
Markel was shot as he drove his car into his garage on July 18th. The killer and the motive still unknown.
Author Tova Mirvis has changed many, many details. But as I read, all I could think about was the real-life comparison. I wasn't sure I could actually do this interview, but at the same time, the writer in me really, really wanted to talk to Tova about this line between fiction and real life, where stories start and where stories end. Tova Mirvis, I'm really eager to talk to you about your brand new novel, your debut thriller, We Would Never. Welcome to Check This Out.
Rachel, I'm so happy to be here with you today. Thank you.
So, Tova, to set up our conversation, I'd love it if you could read from the prologue just to put us in the book, We Would Never, and set the scene for us.
Sure. I watched the video in the middle of the night, trying to understand. The ex-wife sits behind a gray table in a small police interrogation room. The walls are cinder block, the lighting is fluorescent, her hair is blonde. On the video, her face appears grainy, the way you would see someone on a security camera. "We called you here," says the police officer sitting across from her, "because there's been a shooting. I'm sorry to tell you this, but your ex-husband, Jonah Gelman, was shot inside his home this morning. He was taken to the hospital, but unfortunately, he didn't make it." "Oh my God," the woman cries, bringing her hands to her mouth and hunching forward. "I know this is a shock," the officer says, his voice gentle, his words unhurried, "but I'm hoping you might be able to help us understand what happened." The ex-wife begins to weep with long gasping sounds that sound more animal than human. Frantically, she looks around the room, as if she can't believe where she finds herself.
And there we go. Tova, I love that you just set that up for us. Thank you so much. Can you briefly give us the sort of real life story of what happened and then what you changed so we get a sense of sort of what we're going to be talking about?
Sure. In 2014, the Florida state law professor Dan Markel was shot inside his home in what seemed to be a hitman job. And over the years, he was in the middle of a very contentious divorce. And over the years, first, a series of hitmen were arrested who had a tangential connection to his ex-wife's family. And then members of his ex-wife's family were arrested and are on trial actually right now for hiring a hitman to kill him during a very ugly custody battle.
So this is real life, as real as it gets, because it's actually still going on right now. It's not resolved.
No, it's not resolved. The mother-in-law of Dan Markel, or the ex-mother-in-law, is going to be on trial in June in Florida for hiring this hitman. And so, yes, the trial is unfolding. It's been going on for 10 years.
And there was even something happening on your pub date, right?
She was in court on my pub date for sort of a trial conference. She was alleging that she was being mistreated in court, and there was sort of discussion about whether she would be moved to a different prison. But yes, the trial is just playing out in real time, which is very strange to see these characters who feel so real to me having their day in court as the book is coming out.
Okay, so that's the real life story. Now, can you bring us into your book and sort of how did you change that? Because your book is fiction. It's based on that real story, but it is not the real story. So how did you change it?
Well, I took the real story. I've always been fascinated by the real story. Rachel, like you, I had a very tangential connection to Dan Markel, the man who was murdered. And as soon as I heard the news story, I was, really curious to know what had happened and spent years going down the rabbit hole. So I took the real story and took the bare bones of that story and turned it into a novel. And I was interested in really exploring the question of how does a family come to do such a horrible thing? How does a divorce escalate so fully out of control that you could hire a hitman to resolve it?
So you didn't actually know the mother or the wife or these characters that you examined, but as a writer, you sort of imagined what it would be like to be in their head, right?
Yes, and my frustration really with the way we, can find true crime online is we don't really get to know the real people. We just see the way they look from the outside. We hear what people say about them, but we never get access to what they're really thinking and feeling, which to me is really the interesting part. I want to know, what are they thinking about the night before a murder? What do they feel after it's done? And the media, the true crime stories can't give you that. Really, only fiction can give you that inner world.
But in your novel, we would never, I felt like you knew your characters, right? And you had based them on the real life people, but you didn't actually know them. So I'm imagining you did like hours and hours. You spent hours and hours watching videos of the real life people. Is that right?
Well, I started off with videos. I mean, it's amazing what you can find online. I did start off with videos of the real people. There's a ton of stuff if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But at some point, I had to stop thinking about the real people in the story and let them become characters the way you would in any novel. And I had to bring myself into them and really just imagine them as people, ask myself questions about, what could make me be this angry or why do people get so enraged or what causes people to feel trapped? All those questions that really separate from the real story because I didn't know if that's what the real people were feeling. And I had to let them just be characters the way I would any other novel.
But they are based on real people. Did the real family, did Dan Markel's actual family, so he was the man who was murdered in 2014, have they contacted you? Have they been in touch with you?
No, they haven't. I mean, the book just came out, so, it's hard to know what kind of response there will be from the real people. I have been getting some emails from people who did know either Dan Markel, the man who was murdered, or members of the Adelson family, the family who has been arrested and some are convicted. So I have started to hear from people who have had these connections. And, it's certainly strange writing a book that's so based in reality where people are, write to me and say, I know him or I went on a date with him or I have this connection. And so that has been, it's one of the strange parts of writing a novel. For me, it feels like this thing I've created in private and then it goes out into the world and people respond to it in different ways.
I mean, the entire time I read it, I had Dan's face in my head, right? I mean, like I'm thinking about Dan, but then I know that everything in there is made up. This isn't the real Dan. This is Jonah. This is your character. Haley, that's the wife, the names that you gave your characters in the book. Did you have pictures of the real characters around you as you were writing this?
No, and very much purposefully, I did not wanna do that. I mean, of course, I know what they look like from just reading about the story, but I really was not interested in sort of trying to bring those real people into the book. I know a lot of people, like you, Rachel, who know Dan. They said, if you wanna talk to us about him, I can tell you details, and I was like, "No, I don't want that." I wanted to separate. I wasn't interested in portraying the actual man, Dan Markel. I felt like I needed to create a completely separate character, and really for all of them, even though I took bits and pieces, novelists always borrow things from real life and they get mixed in different ways, but I very much did not want pictures of the real people. I didn't feel like I wanted to sort of imagine my way into what those actual people were thinking, but I wanted to take those people and imagine my way into characters who bear a relationship to those real people.
Why did you feel compelled, this deep need to write this book? I ask because when I write a novel, it's years. It's a big commitment. So what compelled you to dive into this story?
Right, I mean, it's years. This is not like a little part-time hobby. It's something that you have to be willing to live with, day in and day out. And I think for me, what really got to me about this particular true crime story was the way that the family, this seems, more or less ordinary. They seem like they were going through a divorce, which so many people go through. The news story happened soon after my own divorce, which was not fun by any means, but certainly did not end up in a murder. And I was really interested in the way that, so many people go through divorce and they move on. It's painful, it's hard, and they get over it and they move forward with their lives. And I felt like I needed to understand what about this story was so different? Why could these people not move on? And I think I wanted to understand, was I, or anyone who's been through a divorce, were we separated from this kind of crazy story by miles, or were we separated by inches from a story that could go so off the rails?
And what did you conclude?
Well, I concluded that it was closer to inches than miles. I really did. I felt like, I don't think all of us are capable of hiring a hitman. I really don't. I think that that takes a certain kind of personality to be willing to do that. But I did come to feel that we don't always know what we're capable of in situations we can't really imagine. I came to feel like when we feel that our children are in danger or when we're pushed, when there's a sense of anger escalating, we don't always know what we would do. And I felt like these stories, we hear about true crime stories at their extreme states after the crazy has happened, after someone has snapped. But if you rewind those stories a little bit, these are just ordinary people whose lives veer off in these very crazy ways.
And you get to some very unflattering portrayals of the people in this book. I mean, someone who is veering off is not in their best moment. So, how did you really dig into that? I mean, while also sort of being connected to these characters in this world. You knew Dan, you knew some of these people involved, and yet you had to dig into these ugly pieces in your characters. So, how did you do that?
Well, I always had to think of them as human. And certainly at the start of the book, I had to think of them as people who had not yet done something wrong. I couldn't go in thinking about them as murderers. I had to think about them as people who were a little angry, who were going through a hard time. And I think whenever you write a novel, you always have to love all of your characters. They don't have to be perfect. You're certainly going to lead them down paths where you really test who they are and push them into very difficult places. But I always wanted to remember the humanity inside them, inside every character, to really ask myself, how could this happen? I wasn't interested in the idea of, oh, they're psychopaths. That's the answer. That to me is very unsatisfying. I'm interested in how people make mistakes, how people take one step too far and then one step too far and then another step. And all of a sudden, they're somewhere unrecognizable.
I love how you're talking about the humanity here, because I think a lot of people that I know dig into true crime and are obsessed with it because they sort of want to see the monsters. They want to see the bad side. But what I'm hearing you saying is actually, let's start with the humanity and let's start there, right? And see where someone begins before they become that monster.
Right, I think on one hand, we like true crime because we like to see the monster. We like to see danger while we are safe at home. We like to peer out at all the ways things can go so horribly wrong. But I think we're interested in it also not just because of that. I think we're interested in these stories because they're close to home. I mean, you read these news stories where something terrible happens to someone, or, I think about the Karen Reed story where something crazy happens on this night and you don't know what it is and who's telling the truth and who's misremembering. That is not something that's so impossibly out of all of our realms. Maybe we all can find ourselves in a place where we don't quite know how something happened. And I think we read true crime and consume true crime for both of those reasons, both the monstrous crazy and the parts that are just uncomfortably close to us.
So we already talked a little bit about how you knew the characters, the real life characters. You got to know your book characters too, but you knew the real life characters before you started. Were you really nervous about publishing this book and putting it out into the public?
I was. I mean, certainly as a writer, I feel like, I'm nervous about everything. Every part of writing is nerve-wracking, but I was very nervous over the years, just thinking that this book was, on one hand, my own creation, and on the other hand, has this very close real life correlation. And I felt like I had to, I knew that the story was in the public domain. I felt like from a legal point of view, that was something that was important to me to know. This was not taking a private family story. I felt like when there's a Dateline special about a case, it kind of enters the public domain in a different way. And I felt like my obligation was to be compassionate on all fronts. I wasn't trying to this wasn't sort of a hit job on the people. It was not trying to really, be like, "Oh my god, let's look at these horrible people." But in some ways I worried if I was being too generous to them. Also, I felt like I wanted to find, that sense of humanity. I wanted to find who they were, which is not to justify it. I wasn't trying to say, "Oh, let's understand, maybe sometimes we all hire a hitman every now and then." That was not my point. But it was just to look at, what makes people do the things they do. And I felt like that was what a novel specifically is able to do.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Tova Mirvis, and we are talking about her brand new debut thriller, We Would Never. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn Faulkner Foundation. Tova, your brand new novel, We Would Never, is a true crime story based on the real-life murder of Dan Markel in 2014. And you have fictionalized it, you've made your own characters. It adheres to the basic plot, but you have put your own magic into this book. But because you started with a real-life true crime story, a murder-for-hire story, did your editors or any of your readers ever sort of go back and fact-check and make you change things to stay closer to the story? Or were you given just total freedom?
I did feel total freedom in writing it. I did not write it with any kind of guidance about how close or how far to be to the story. But once it was done, there was a legal read where I made a list of every single thing that was the same and every single thing that was different. And it was just to cover our bases, just to look at legal questions with writing about it. But it was felt that the story was in the public domain and I had changed drastic amounts of the book. There were some things I did not want to change. The real story is set in Florida. And there was a suggestion very late in the game, could I move it out of Florida? But I just felt like this was a Florida story. I couldn't really see setting it anywhere else. I was interested in sort of the hot, swampy, enmeshed feeling of Florida, which I felt like matches the kind of family I was writing about. So I stuck to that one. Other facts I changed. In the real life story, they are a family of dentists. And at first, it was hard to give that up. I love the idea of writing about dentists with their sharp tools and, the cavities in their mouths and the cavities in their souls. But I eventually decided that I was going to change that. Was willing to let go of that. And so I turned them into dermatologists, which had its own metaphorical possibilities.
So let's dive a little bit into the characters themselves. On the surface, this book is about a murder for hire and a divorce. It's about Haley and Jonah. Those are the names of your characters, not the real life names of the people involved. But for me, I felt like the real main character was Haley's mother, Sherry. And I realize that might sound crazy because she's the mother, not the one getting divorced. But for me, she really was the one that I followed, that I was reading at the center of the book. Can you tell us about Sherry?
Sure. I also feel like Sherry is in many ways the main character. She is the mother of three children, and she has really devoted her life to raising her three children, Nate and Adam and Haley, her youngest. And she is someone who values family closeness. She wants to have her kids all together as often as she can. And once she becomes an empty nester, she really struggles with the fear that she is going to end up all alone after all this time she's put into her kids and all this effort. And when her daughter gets divorced, yes, as you said, she's not the one getting divorced, but she's so involved in her daughter's life that it feels like it's happening to her.
You actually spend a lot of time with her reflecting on marriage and what marriage means and being with a spouse, what it means. Would you read for us one of her reflections, one of my favorites?
Yes. He went upstairs to their bedroom, and though she would have once implored him to share what he was feeling, she let him go. It was one of the truths of her marriage, maybe any marriage, that she'd long ago learned to accept. Just because you spent your life with someone didn't mean you knew them entirely. There would always be aspects of him she couldn't understand.
I loved that paragraph because I felt like that's what this book was about. How do you slip from a normal, ordinary person to someone who's hiring a hitman? Or like they're just pieces of yourself maybe that you don't understand.
Right, that idea that, we don't know the people we're closest to. We think we know everything about our children or our spouses, and we don't. And, as you said, I don't think we know everything about ourselves. We don't always know what we're capable of doing. And I think that is maybe the scariest part of these stories. True crime has, footsteps in the night and creaking open doors. But the fact that we don't know ourselves always, that's the part that really freaks me out.
And that there's an inner desperation is really what you also dig into with these characters.
Right. This inner anxiety about being alone, a fear of being cut off from their children, a fear of being disliked. These very normal feelings that we all have at one point or another become exacerbated and they escalate out of control. But I think that they all start in this place of sort of common feelings of sadness that so many of us have.
At one point, you even address the issue of maybe someone doesn't know what they're capable of, what they might actually do, and someone would casually say, I would never do something. But then you point out with one of your characters, actually, maybe they might. Could you read that passage where you go through that?
Sure. People like to make all kinds of proclamations about what they would never do. But people did all sorts of things, and never was a very long time. And in his experience, people who said things like that lacked imagination. All it meant was that they hadn't yet found themselves in a situation where they might.
So I love this. I love this idea. And all that meant was that they hadn't yet found themselves in a situation where they might. And that's where you have really set us up for. Maybe it is only inches apart from hiring a hitman in your life versus moving on from your divorce.
I mean, that was really where the title came for me. I didn't have a title for a long time, but I was really interested in this idea of things that we think we would never do and really asking that question of, are we so sure?
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Tova Mirvis, and we are talking about her brand new novel, We Would Never. This is a real-life true crime story. It is ripped from the headlines, except it's fiction. And Tova has really adapted this novel, changed it, made it her own, but it is based on the real-life murder for hire in 2014 of Dan Markel. And what is amazing about this book is that Tova and I actually both knew Dan Markel. But these characters that Tova has created are not the real-life Dan Markel or any of the real-life people in there. She's created entirely new characters and a new story. One of the things that I really wanted to dig into, that Tova really digs into so well in this novel, is this idea of knowing someone but not knowing them at all. And this idea of a public face versus the private face and what you see privately. And Tova, you do this really well with Haley, the wife, the character in your book. And you introduce this moment where she talks about how I can't stand looking at my husband and seeing him one person in public, but knowing he's someone entirely different in private. I want to ask you to read a passage for us so we can talk a little bit more about this.
Sure. I can't stand sitting at these appointments with him. He talks the whole time as if he's the one doing everything for Maya. Next week, I'm going to have to be with him for Maya's first day of kindergarten. Do you have any idea what that's like? He puts on this show for everyone. If I didn't know better, I would think he was the greatest person ever. I'm sure that's what everyone else thinks. People see through things. They know you're there for Maya. No, they don't. They believe every word he says, and it makes me wonder if I'm the crazy one to be so angry all the time. But he takes everything I say and twists it. He provokes me, and I get upset, and then he uses that against me.
Thanks for reading. That passage really digs into the heart of the divorce, the anger, the frustration. There's someone different that Haley sees in private from what's in public, but this feeling that she's being twisted around. We start to see it there. Can you tell us about those feelings?
Divorce has a way of really upending the narrative of who does what and who says what. All of a sudden, you have these two competing sides of a story where if you talk to one person in a divorce, that story might be entirely different if you talk to their partner or their ex-partner in the divorce. All of a sudden, there's no unified story. And I think that's why divorce is so unmooring. You can't even agree on what the truth is of a story. And I wanted to use that in writing the book to create the way that divorce just rips through this family where they have to ask themselves, who is he and who are we? And no one is sure anymore of who they are.
And we see that clearly with Haley and Jonah, the two characters who are the husband and wife. But I've got to bring us back to Sherry. Sherry's the mother, because at the same time, she becomes someone that she doesn't recognize either. She is also spiraling and spiraling downward. Tell us about Sherry's spiral.
When Sherry first meets her son-in-law to be, she's very determined to like him. She wants him to like her. And she puts a lot of energy into this. And then she comes to realize that he actually does not like her and does not want to spend time with the family. And when her daughter is still married to Jonah, she tries to hold on to the front that we're all okay and we all get along. But once divorce comes through that family, there's no longer a reason to get along. And that quiet feeling of discomfort really can open up. And she is furious at him for the way he's treated her in the marriage and now the way he regards her daughter now that they're getting divorced. And that fury, it's been suppressed for so many years, and now it just comes pouring out of her.
And in so many ways, a divorce is between the husband and the wife. But you show in this book, in your novel, We Would Never, that really it's much bigger than that for Haley in this book. And her mother feels like this is her life just as much as it is her daughter's life.
Right. People like to say when you marry someone, you marry their whole family. But I think when you divorce someone, you often divorce the family as well. In this family where everyone is so enmeshed and so involved in each other's lives, a divorce is not just something happening to one member of the family, but really they all feel like they're being divorced and they all feel like it's their job to protect their daughter or their sister. It's not just something she's going to go through alone.
And so we also see the brothers step up. Haley has two brothers, and they also sort of come around to protect her. Tell us about the two brothers.
Sure. Well, Haley's oldest brother, Nate, is someone who is very much focused on protecting her. He's a little bit brash. He has a dark sense of humor. He's a little impulsive and was always getting in trouble when they were younger. But the one thing he's always really been focused on is being there for his younger sister. And so as adults, when he sees her in pain and sees her struggling, he really knows that he is going to be there to protect her. The other sibling in the family, Adam, has a very different experience of the family. For all that everyone else is close and very involved in each other's lives, Adam has always felt like he does not fit into their family and that he is not really one of them. And so he is estranged from all of them, in particular his mother, Sherry. And he has decided to leave the family, to leave Florida, and he lives in Maine, where he runs a dog sanctuary. And that actually comes into the novel in a different way, where Haley ends up being with Adam as a way to escape her own family.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Tova Mirvis, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Tova Mirvis's brand new novel, We Would Never. And we're digging into the family. This is a real-life, ripped from the headlines, true crime story of murder for hire. Two characters in the book, Haley and Jonah, are in the middle of a contentious divorce, and a hitman is hired, and the husband is killed. You really dive into these characters. But I want to step back again to the real life 2014 murder of Dan Markel, because that was in the back of my head the entire time I'm reading this and I'm learning about these characters. How much of the real life characters did you include, or how did you get to the characters that are in the book versus what they are in real life?
Well, I started with the real life characters. I started with what was sort of said publicly about these characters. The mother, Donna Adelson, was described as being controlling or intrusive. So that was my starting point. But then, as a novelist, you have to ask the question of, well, why is someone intrusive? Or what does controlling even mean? And so I had to open that up and to look at, well, what is that about for a character? What makes someone be this way? And for all the people in the news might print she's controlling, the novelist can't stop there. The novelist has to look at, well, what are the ways she's controlling? What does she say? How do people respond to her? What is she thinking privately? And so the real news story was a starting point, but it's never an end point.
So how do you build her character? How do you do that when you have a real life starting point?
I think that's the work of writing fiction. It's sitting with the characters over months and months, years really. I write notes for myself. I try to sketch out the characters. I ask questions. I try to let them just become real to me. I take bits and pieces of myself, of people I know in my own life, and just my imagination to really ask myself, what is this about? What's really going on here in this story? And to try to find that inner human part to every character.
We don't see as much of Jonah's family in this book. For me, the center was really Sherry, who is the mother-in-law of the man who's killed. Jonah is the character in the book, but we don't really see much of his family. Why?
I decided that I was going to keep the book focused on this one family, the family who commits the murder. I felt like to write another sort of family would have opened it up too broadly, and I really wanted to create this almost suffocating family feel. And so we don't see Jonah from his point of view. We only see him through the eyes of the family. And the other thread of the book that takes place a few years later, you get a little more of Jonah through Haley when she begins to reflect a little bit on the question of, did she only see him from her point of view? What might he have been experiencing during their divorce? In a divorce, I think we cling so tightly to our own points of view. It's very hard to imagine the inner story of the person who we are being divorced from. But she begins to ask herself, what was his experience like? And so you get a little more of Jonah, maybe in a slightly less biased way than you do when you're only seeing him through the family.
So your last book was a memoir where you wrote about your own divorce. So what was it like to go from a memoir writing about your divorce, your life experience, to a book about this murder for hire about divorce?
I mean, writing memoir about a divorce is very tricky because, the real people are very connected to me. It's not a public story. There's no Dateline special about my divorce. And so I had an awareness that I was writing about a private story. And certainly, on no one's wish list in a divorce is an ex-wife who's writing a memoir. And so I had to be careful. And I had to really decide what I was going to put in and what I was going to leave out. And so after that book, when I had this opportunity to write fiction about it, it felt very freeing. I felt like I could take some of the feelings of my divorce, some of the ways it feels so obliterating and unmooring, and use the feelings, but the facts are totally different. And so I could create a divorce that goes off the rails. And it was just really fun to write about a divorce that was not my own.
Have a lot of people been asking you about the divorce aspects in this book?
Yes, I mean, people have asked me, "Oh, is this the real story of your divorce?" And I always say, "No, no murders, no hitman. It wasn't like that at all. My divorce was probably a very typical, everyone gets mad and then everyone moves on kind of divorce."
But at the center in this book, we would never, is the child. And the daughter, Jonah and Haley, they have a little girl, and she is really the reason why everything starts to escalate.
Right. I mean, in a divorce, you can fight about money or you can fight about possessions, but really fighting about custody, I think, is the real wound for so many people. And certainly in the real story and in the novel, the question of custody is what really sets the book on fire and really makes everyone so furious because you can't divide a child. And that fact is what makes people fight so hard.
I imagine it was so hard to write about that part of this book, the little girl there that everyone's fighting over.
I mean, it was where I felt my greatest sense of empathy for this child who was really being pulled in two directions. In the book and in the real story, the custody battle is about whether the mother should be allowed to relocate to live close to her family. And I felt like you could argue it both ways. On one hand, of course, the father does not want his child to move to another state or another part of the state and be far away from him. And yet, on the other hand, you could see why a wife who's moved somewhere she never wanted to live and is now divorced might want to live close to family. I felt like in a divorce, so often you can argue at both sides. It just depends on whose point of view you're willing to hear. And there was no good solution for this and no good answer that would make everyone happy. And instead of trying to find a way to compromise, of course, they resorted to something so unimaginable.
The worst part of this entire story in real life is that this was all based in love. What Sherry, the mother, does in the book is because she loves her children. What Haley does is because she loves her child. What Jonah does is because he loves the child. And yet all of it leads to this horrific murder. All your characters have tried to protect the child, but in fact, she's the one who's getting hurt the most.
Yes, that seems to me the tragedy of this story and of so many stories like this, that they begin out of a desire to protect a loved one, to be close to a loved one, to somehow be there for someone they love, and yet they spiral so out of control and end up hurting everyone. When I look at the real story, which I do sometimes from time to time, I go back down that rabbit hole. I think what I feel most is that it's just a tragedy. I mean, obviously a tragedy that this family, I guess, allegedly killed the father of their grandchildren. But they didn't just do that. They destroyed their own family in the process. And that to me is such a tragedy that no one could find a way to back down. No one could find any kind of compassion or forgiveness so that they didn't end up in this horrific way.
Tova Mirvis, in your new book, We Would Never, you are really following a true crime story that is still unfolding. Literally on your pub day, there was supposed to be an appearance that the mother-in-law who's being charged in this murder for hire was supposed to appear at. How closely are you still watching all of it?
Well, for a while, I watched it very closely. The story took place in Tallahassee. So if you follow the Tallahassee Democrat, you can watch 24/7 coverage. You can see every minute of the trial. And so there was a period where I watched a lot of it. And then when I was really focusing on writing the book, I stopped watching it as much. I felt like I needed to let my book be separate from the real story. But the next trial is scheduled for June, and that is for the mother characters, Mike Sherry and the real woman, Donna Adelson. I think I'm probably going to be watching it pretty closely.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Tova Mirvis, and we are talking about her brand new novel, We Would Never. This novel is based on the real-life murder-for-hire story of Dan Markel that happened in 2014. Tova has turned it into fiction. The characters in her book are based on the real life, but they are not real life. But of course, in the process of writing this novel, Tova, you have really been pulled into this case. You've been watching the details. Is there anything that surprised you in the real-life trial as this is unfolding, as this is happening? Anything that really took you aback?
Well, I watched the trial of Charlie Adelson, who is the brother who it seems to me in the real story was probably the mastermind of it. And he mounted this very elaborate defense of blackmail and misunderstanding. And I think what surprised me most was it seemed to me like he thought that he was going to get away with it. And that I think with all of these stories, I just find so surprising that people think they're going to somehow be the one family member, the one ex-family member who is not caught. And in general, in these cases, when there's a spousal murder case, the person is usually caught and convicted. And it just seems so surprising, this elaborate defense, and that he looked stunned when he was found guilty in just a matter of hours. And I just felt like I really don't think that anyone was going to buy the story that they concocted about it just being a misunderstanding and a blackmail gone wrong.
And was there anything that surprised you as you were writing this book?
I think what surprised me was the way that I think that these stories happen very slowly. I think that they happen by a series of escalations. It doesn't happen that someone gets divorced and the family gets angry and the next day they say, let's hire a hitman. I think it happens in these small incremental steps where they have a screaming fight or they begin to joke about killing someone or they decide maybe let's try to pay him off. Each little step is its own thing, and yet it leads to the next thing. And I think once I constructed that sort of plot for myself, it made me realize how people fall into these ways of thinking and head down these paths and don't realize the dangerous territory they are entering into.
Now that you've written a novel based on a real life murder for hire, what do you think about these ripped from the headlines books and podcasts and everything that are coming out all the time now?
I watched some of them. It's funny. I was never a huge true crime junkie before. I would sort of get involved in one or two stories that would interest me. But I think what I feel about so many of them is I feel a sense of frustration. I feel like, I can listen, I put in all the hours and I listen to them, but I don't get the real story. I don't get the part that's most interesting to me, which is the inner life. I listened to a podcast recently about a woman who was having an affair with her husband's best friend, and then the husband disappears. And at first, it's sort of set up to look like he was eaten by alligators, but maybe the husband's best friend did kill him. And it was sort of entertaining. I love Florida, the Florida stories. But at the end of the day, I felt like I didn't really learn what I wanted, which was how did they think of this idea? How did they live with themselves if they did, in fact, do this? How do they feel the next day? How do they feel a few years later? True crime podcasts rarely can give you that kind of information. And so often I come away with just a wanting to know more than I have access to.
Do you feel like you owe either of the real life families involved? Do you owe them anything?
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that certainly for Dan Markel's family, I wanted to change the book so fully so that it was not him at all. I did not include his family at all. I sort of purposely made decisions so that his family was not part of the book. I wanted to distance the book from him as much as possible because that is where my real compassion lies for him and for his family. And so I wanted the book not to ostensibly be about them or not to have any comment on who they are and how they have had to navigate this path of grief. For the Adelson family, I feel like given that two of the four members have been charged with murder and one convicted, I don't feel that I owe them something in the same way. I don't feel like I had to steer the book away from them because I do feel that given the conviction of Charlie Adelson and the upcoming trial of Donna Adelson, I felt like their conviction and their arrest put this story in the public eye already. The story has been covered so fully in the media and so exhaustively, really, certainly in Florida and in true crime podcasts. There have been true crime books about it and just so much coverage that I felt like this was one more piece of that coverage. And I felt like it was a more human piece of it. It was not an attempt to tell their actual story, but to take that story and transform it into fiction. And so it's one step removed differently than the Dateline story is, or the podcast, or the true crime coverage is.
You knew the real life Dan Markel, the man who was murdered in 2014, and you know all of your characters in your book, We Would Never, super, super well. Who feels more real to you at this point?
Think my characters feel much more real. I knew Dan very tangentially. My ex-husband went to college with him, and I think we met once in a large group of people, and I knew him on Facebook. So very tangential connection to him. And I purposely did not want to go digging. And, for all the people who offered to tell me stories about him or help him become real, I was very much not interested in that because I didn't want Dan Markel to become real to me as a person for the sake of writing. And so my characters feel a lot more real to me. And the family, the Adelson family, of course, I know them only the way anyone knows them, by going down the Google rabbit hole. Which is certainly things in a certain way, but you don't really know them. And so my characters are the ones who feel like real people to me now.
I imagine now that the book is published, We Would Never, that you're probably going to get a lot of emails and comments yourself, right, with people and their opinions.
Right, you always get opinions. I mean, part of having a book go onto the world is you hear a lot of things and people write reviews and write comments, and everyone has their own take on a book. And I guess maybe because this is my fifth book, I've learned that people write all sorts of things, people have opinions, everyone reads a book and feels very differently about it. And so, I'm interested to hear comments, but I know that it's always filtered through a person's own experience.
I bet you're going to see some interesting comments about the murder itself and your take on the family.
Yes. I mean, one of the things I love is that people who are also obsessed with this case have been talking to me about it because I have that urge to talk about the story. I feel like, did you see that? And did you hear this? And so it is fascinating to talk to other people who know every detail of the story as well. I did a book event in Coral Gables last week where the true crime story took place, and everyone there knew every detail.
Wow, that must have been incredible.
It was. It was a perfect place to do an event. I felt like I was really right inside the world of this story.
But there are other people in the world that know all the details in this case. Are they emailing you? Are you on a forum with them? Or how are they getting in touch with you?
I've just started to hear from people. It just came out. So I have just started to hear from people. But people have either emailed me through my website or there are different forums online where people who follow this case can comment about it.
And are you a part of them? Have you been a part of those for years?
I've been part of one on Facebook that's called Justice for Dan, where a few friends of Dan have posted information about the case over the years. And so I've followed that Facebook group for many years.
So now that you've written a true crime novel, do you have advice for people who are thinking they might want to do the same?
I think, on one hand, it's writing a book from the headlines is a great thing because it gives you a plot, which as a writer, there's no greater gift you can get than a plot. But I think what I would advise people is to really ask those questions about the parts that are beyond the headlines, to really try to delve into the characters and to think about these true crime stories, not as these outrageous tales. Try to think of them as being a little closer to home, as ordinary families before all of these things start happening to them.
So would you write another true crime plot?
Maybe. I have been getting emails from people who've been sending me stories of, like, other spousal murderers and saying, "For your next book." Maybe, I don't know. I think probably I need a little rest from it. I think that I've delved so deeply into spousal murders right now that I think I probably need to read something a little different or maybe write something that does not involve divorce and murder for my next book.
But that's funny to think that you might become an author who's known for writing these kinds of stories.
Right, it's definitely not what I envisioned. It's sort of funny when I get these emails saying, "This we thought this would be perfect for you," because I definitely did not think of myself as, like, the divorce murder expert.
Nor were you a thriller writer before this book. I mean, this book, We Would Never, was pitched to me as your debut thriller.
Right, but it's funny, it's a different book than my other books. I've written 3 novels, and they are all very character driven. I'm interested in people and, like We Would Never, I'm interested in what people do publicly versus who they are privately. I think that to me is one of the most interesting questions in fiction. And so this book is about that. I guess the thriller part of it is that there is a murder and there is a question of who did it. But, I think of the book really being so much more about how and why they did it.
What advice do you have for new writers that are just starting their journey?
I think writing is a long process, and I know so well that urge to try to finish, to kind of get to the end. But I think one of the things I've learned the most over all my years of writing is being patient and being willing to revise and go back again and again. It's hard to take apart a book that you think is done, but I think the way you really get to the end is by willing to just go through revision, get feedback from people, listen to critique, go back in and do another draft.
And you've experienced that a lot. We Would Never, how long did that take you to write?
It took about 5 years. And so probably 2 or 3 years of actually working on the book and then 2 years more of getting feedback from different people and incorporating that feedback and doing multiple drafts. Every time I made a big change in the book, I would change the file number. So it started off as New Novel 1. By the time I gave it to my editor, it was called New Novel 58.
Amazing. I hear a lot from writers that the newer writers want to just hurry, and get it done and get it to an agent or get it published. But then the reality is you need to slow down and really dig into your story and your characters.
Right. I mean, the urge to be done. I mean, of course, we all want to just feel like, oh, I'm, finished with this book. But I think the only way to really write a book that's layered and complicated and that works is to go slow, is to finish a draft, put it away for a few weeks, ask for feedback. Of course, the only thing you want to hear as a writer is it's perfect, don't change a word, but that's rarely true. And I think so much of writing is being willing to hear the feedback, take a deep breath, and then go back into the book and make it better.
Tova, your new book, We Would Never, is based on the true crime murder of Dan Markel in 2014. The case is ongoing. It's still unfolding. How closely are you going to watch it going forward?
I think I'm still addicted. I'm going to watch it pretty closely. I'm looking forward to the June trial date of Donna Adelson. I probably won't watch every single minute of it. I think that there's some sense that writing the book probably unleashed a little bit of that obsession with it, but I am still very interested to know how this real story is playing out.
And are other people in your family watching with you? Or is it just like, oh, mom's watching that again?
My husband and I have watched all of it. There was a time when he was watching more obsessively than I was. I would fall asleep and I would be like, "You're still watching the trial? You've watched like 15 hours of trial testimony." And so it was definitely a shared obsession. I told him about the story and we listened to a podcast about it. And I was toying with whether to write about it. And, very early on, he said to me, "I don't know how you can resist this story." And I came to feel like I just could not resist it.
Tova Mirvis, thank you so much for joining me today here on Check This Out.
Thank you, Rachel. It's such a pleasure to be here.
It's been such a pleasure to speak to you all about your brand new novel, We Would Never. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. You have been listening to Check This Out, where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. This conversation is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the PEN-Faulkner Foundation. PEN-Faulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the PEN-Faulkner Award for Fiction. I'll be back next week with Samir Pandya, talking about his brand new novel, Our Beautiful Boys. Make sure to check this out. Our producer today is NHPR's Jessica Hunt. Penn Faulkner's executive director is Gwydion Sullivan. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by CNS Wholesale Grocers family of companies, the podcast Totally Booked with Zibby, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and the Howe Library Corporation. Remember to go to your local library or local bookstore and check out all the books you hear about here and love. Thanks for listening. See you next time.